What happens when a regime cuts the power to silence a city and instead ignites a national turning point? On the night of January 10th, Tehran fell into darkness after authorities shut down electricity and internet access across multiple districts, a move intended to fracture coordination and send people back into their homes. The opposite occurred. Within minutes, vast crowds poured into public squares, lifting their phones skyward. Hundreds of thousands of lights pierced the blackout, transforming fear into a visible declaration of presence that could be seen across neighborhoods and symbolically far beyond them. The darkness did not end the gathering. It clarified it. Question for viewers. When a government turns off the lights, does it still control the streets? Or does it reveal how little control remains? Witness accounts described Punak Square as the epicenter. Traffic halted, chants echoed, and the absence of electricity became a rallying point rather than a deterrent. Analysts note that blackouts are a classic crowd control tactic, often effective in dispersing gatherings. Yet this time, the tactic backfired. The crowd's response reframed the blackout as an admission of weakness. When power cuts fail to disperse civilians, one Western security analyst observed, they signal a shift from protest to contestation. The phones were not just light sources. They were a psychological countermeasure neutralizing the regime's advantage in surveillance and night operations. As the night unfolded, similar scenes emerged in Mashhad, Tabriz, Karaj, and Isfahan. The simultaneity mattered. Security forces trained to isolate and encircle suddenly faced multiple flashpoints at once. According to open-source assessments circulating among Western observers, the scale of participation reached well into the millions nationwide by midnight, stretching internal security capacity thin. The regime's bet that darkness would fragment the crowds instead synchronized them. This moment did not arise from spontaneous anger alone. It followed weeks of escalating coordination, with protest networks shifting from symbolic marches to territorial presence. The blackout accelerated that transition. By staying in place, crowds communicated a new intent, not to appear briefly and disappear, but to remain. Strategic intersections were held. Barricades emerged. In several districts, security units withdrew rather than engage, a choice that underscored the changing balance on the ground. International observers quickly drew comparisons to other moments where state power flickered literally and figuratively. The blackout's optics traveled fast through social media once partial connectivity returned. For Western policymakers, including those in Washington under President Donald Trump's administration, the images raised urgent questions about stability in a country that sits at the center of multiple regional fault lines. NATO analysts quietly noted that internal paralysis in Tehran could ripple outward, affecting proxy dynamics, energy routes, and regional deterrence calculations. Economically, the blackout carried its own symbolism. Power cuts have become a recurring feature of life amid sanctions, infrastructure decay, and mismanagement. What changed on January 10th was perception. The outage was no longer read as inconvenience, but as proof of systemic failure. Protesters chanted not only political slogans, but economic grievances, rising prices, lost purchasing power, and the sense that national wealth had been diverted away from citizens. The darkness in that sense illuminated long-standing frustrations. By dawn, the regime faced a stark reality: the streets had not emptied. In several neighborhoods, they had been effectively claimed. Fire services were conspicuously absent when government buildings burned, reinforcing the impression of institutional paralysis. Western risk consultancies began revising their assessments, noting that once crowds hold territory overnight, the threshold for reversal rises dramatically. Yet this was only the opening act. The blackout did more than mobilize people, it altered the rules of engagement. What followed next would shock analysts even further, as the movement revealed it was no longer content with visibility alone, but was preparing for something far more consequential. From the moment dawn broke over Tehran, it became clear that the events of the previous night were not an isolated eruption, but the opening phase of a recalibrated strategy. The crowds that had refused to disperse did not melt away with daylight. Instead, they reorganized. What had once been fluid demonstrations began to harden into something more deliberate, an effort not merely to protest, but to hold. The shift marked a decisive turn from symbolic defiance to spatial control. Security footage and eyewitness reports showed protesters maintaining positions at key intersections, particularly around Punak Farazadi and adjacent districts. Traffic remained blocked, not chaotically, but methodically. Makeshift barriers appeared. Volunteers directed movement. In several areas, security forces pulled back to the perimeter rather than attempt re-entry. Western urban warfare analysts would later describe the pattern as rudimentary territorial denial, a tactic usually seen in insurgent phases, not civic protests. This transition did not occur in a vacuum. In recent months, analysts at outlets such as Reuters and the BBC had documented how prolonged unrest often evolves when crowds lose faith in short-term concessions. The logic becomes cumulative if returning home changes. Nothing staying put becomes rational. January 10th compressed that evolution into a single night. Darkness removed the illusion of normalcy and with it the incentive to retreat. Observers noted another crucial element: the language used by organizers and prominent opposition voices had changed. The emphasis was no longer on marching or slogans alone, but on defending public space. That phrasing mattered. It reframed streets and squares as assets rather than stages. According to one European security expert, once protesters redefined territory as theirs, state authority must either reclaim it decisively or accept erosion. The regime appeared unprepared for this recalibration. Its crowd control doctrine relies on mobility, disperse, regroup, and circle. Holding actions disrupted that cycle. In several instances, riot units reportedly received conflicting orders: advance, then stand down, suggesting confusion higher up the chain of command. The result was hesitation, which further emboldened the crowds. Meanwhile, similar dynamics surfaced beyond the capital. In Mashhad and Tabriz, protesters replicated the same tactics, occupying central arteries and refusing to yield. The replication suggested coordination, or at least rapid learning. NATO-linked analysts monitoring regional stability flagged this as a warning sign. Once tactics spread horizontally, across cities, containment becomes exponentially harder. Economic factors reinforced the resolve to hold ground. Many protesters openly framed their presence as a response to systemic deprivation. Inflation, currency collapse, and recurring energy shortages had already eroded trust. Holding territory became a way to force visibility onto grievances long ignored. If the state controls resources, the public controls space, remarked a Western economist analyzing the protests' logic. For Washington and European capitals, the implications extended beyond Iran's borders. A regime struggling to secure its own capital has limited bandwidth to project power externally. Under President Donald Trump, U.S. officials quietly assessed how sustained internal pressure might constrain Tehran's regional posture, from proxy funding to energy corridor security. NATO planners, meanwhile, weighed second-order effects on markets and alliances. Yet even as the crowds consolidated their positions, uncertainty loomed. Holding territory invites escalation. Would the regime regroup and attempt to retake these zones by force? Or would the paralysis deepen? The answer depended on whether internal cohesion still existed at the top. What followed next surprised even seasoned observers, as signs of fracture began to emerge from within the very structure meant to suppress the streets. By the third night, the unrest had taken on a dimension that even pessimistic forecasts had underestimated. What began as concentrated pressure in Tehran now unfolded as a nationwide domino effect, with cities igniting almost in parallel. Mashhad, Tabriz, Rasht, Isfahan, Karaj, and several provincial centers experienced synchronized surges in street activity, stretching security forces across an unmanageable geographic span. The regime's long-standing strategy, isolating hotspots one by one, collapsed under the weight of simultaneity. Open-source intelligence analysts tracking geolocated footage estimated participation numbers climbing sharply as the night progressed. Early figures suggested well over 1 million people nationwide before midnight, with the momentum continuing into the early hours. What alarmed observers was not just the size, but the timing. The protests peaked simultaneously rather than sequentially, denying the state its ability to redeploy units. Western security assessments noted that once unrest crosses a critical mass across multiple provinces, the center becomes vulnerable, not because it is weaker, but because it is everywhere at once. Mashhad carried particular symbolic weight. As a religious stronghold and the birthplace of the Supreme Leader, it had long been treated as politically resilient terrain. Yet chants echoing through its streets mirrored those in Tehran. Analysts described this as an ideological breach rather than a tactical one. When core constituencies mobilize, repression loses its psychological edge. At that point, one European intelligence source observed authority stops radiating outward. The ripple effect also disrupted logistics. Roadblocks, fuel shortages, and communication blackouts compounded one another. Security units reported difficulties receiving instructions as networks faltered. In some regions, police presence dwindled to near invisibility, not due to defeat, but to overstretch. Fire services and municipal responders failed to intervene as government buildings burned, reinforcing the perception of institutional paralysis. The state apparatus still existed, but its reflexes no longer aligned. Economic anger intensified the spread. Protests increasingly targeted symbols of fiscal authority, tax offices, municipal centers, and administrative hubs. These were not random targets. They represented accumulated grievances over inflation, unemployment, and the sense that national wealth had been siphoned away. Western economists following the situation pointed out that when crowds attack fiscal nodes rather than security installations, they are making a statement about legitimacy, not just power. From a geopolitical perspective, the domino effect set off alarms in Western capitals. Iran's internal destabilization coincided with heightened regional tensions, including ongoing strikes on energy infrastructure tied to broader conflicts. NATO analysts warned that prolonged unrest could disrupt energy routes and recalibrate regional deterrence equations. Under President Donald Trump, U.S. officials reportedly weighed how sustained domestic pressure might limit Tehran's capacity to respond abroad, particularly through proxy networks. Crucially, the spread created feedback loops. Success in one city emboldened another. Footage traveled faster than suppression orders. Each retreat by security forces amplified confidence elsewhere. This multiplier effect, experts noted, often marks the transition from episodic unrest to systemic challenge. The regime's tools, curfews, blackouts, intimidation had already been deployed. Their diminishing returns were now visible nationwide. Yet the most consequential shift was still unfolding behind closed doors. As the streets synchronized, something inside the ruling structure began to fracture. Statements, silences, and contradictions hinted that pressure from below was triggering recalculations above. What followed next shocked analysts as signs emerged that the regime was no longer speaking with one voice. As the streets filled and held, the most destabilizing development did not come from outside the system, but from within it. The regime's outward posture of unity began to fracture under pressure, revealing contradictions that had long been suppressed. Statements from senior officials, once carefully synchronized, now diverged in tone and implication. Silence from some quarters proved as telling as outspoken criticism from others. Observers in Tehran noted that official messaging shifted abruptly. Instead of unified condemnation of the protests, there were acknowledgments of economic failure, mismanagement, and public frustration. Western analysts described this as a classic sign of elite anxiety. When a ruling structure senses that repression alone may not suffice, it tests alternative narratives. In this case, those narratives unintentionally undermined the very legitimacy they sought to preserve. One particularly striking element was the emergence of nostalgia in official discourse. Comparisons between current economic hardship and pre-revolution living standards surfaced in public remarks. Purchasing power, once dismissed as a secondary concern, became central. For analysts, this represented a breach of taboo. When leaders implicitly concede that life was materially better under a previous system, they weaken the moral foundation of the existing one. Legitimacy, a Western political scientist noted, is not lost when people complain, but when leaders begin to agree with them. This internal dissonance reverberated down the chain of command. Security forces on the ground reportedly received mixed signals: enforce order but avoid escalation, hold positions but limit engagement. Such ambiguity is corrosive in moments of crisis. Soldiers and police are conditioned to act decisively when authority is clear. When it is not, hesitation follows. Footage circulating online showed units standing aside as crowds advanced, not necessarily out of sympathy but uncertainty. The economic dimension deepened the cracks. Inflation, currency erosion, and energy shortages had already strained state capacity. Western economic assessments pointed out that prolonged unrest compounds these pressures, accelerating capital flight and paralyzing revenue collection. When tax offices burned and municipal centers fell idle, it was not just symbolism, it was a direct hit to governance. The state's ability to function day to day came into question. From a strategic standpoint, NATO analysts viewed these internal fractures as more consequential than street clashes. A regime divided against itself cannot easily recalibrate strategy either domestically or regionally. Under President Donald Trump, U.S. policymakers evaluated how such divisions might constrain Tehran's external posture, particularly its ability to sustain commitments beyond its borders. Internal instability forces prioritization and often retreat. Crucially, the fractures altered the psychology of the crowd. Protesters no longer felt they were confronting a monolith. Each contradictory statement from above validated the sense that pressure was working. Momentum fed on perception as much as reality. When authority hesitates, confidence shifts. Western crowd dynamics experts note that this is often the point where movements stop asking whether change is possible and begin assuming it is inevitable. Yet the regime still retained tools: coercion, propaganda, and institutional inertia. The question was whether these tools could be reassembled into a coherent response. The answer depended on whether the narrative could be reclaimed or whether a competing vision had already taken root in the public imagination. Meanwhile, a powerful undercurrent was gaining force, one that did not rely on policy or rhetoric, but on memory, reshaping the struggle into something deeper than resistance. The turning point did not come from a new speech or a fresh confrontation in the streets, but from something far quieter and far more powerful. As the regime's narrative fractured, a competing force surged forward: collective memory. Images, videos, and personal stories from Iran before 1979 flooded social media, spreading faster than any slogan. cafes filled with music, universities alive with debate, women moving freely through public life. These fragments of the past became a political weapon in the present. Could memory itself become a catalyst for change stronger than fear or force? For younger Iranians, many of whom had only known sanctions, isolation, and economic decline, these images carried a shock of discovery. What they saw was not a mythic golden age, but a tangible contrast. Western historians observing the trend noted that nostalgia becomes politically potent when it is supported by evidence. In this case, economic data reinforced the imagery. During the pre-revolution period, Iran's currency was strong, its middle class expanding, and its integration with global markets accelerating. Today, hyperinflation and capital flight tell a different story. The regime had long framed the past as decadent or hollow. That narrative began to collapse under the weight of archival proof. When officials themselves referenced earlier purchasing power or living standards, the effect was seismic. Western sociologists described this as retroactive delegitimization, a moment when a system inadvertently validates the alternative it once overthrew. Each such admission stripped away another layer of ideological insulation. Cultural memory amplified the effect. Music, cinema, and art from earlier decades resurfaced, challenging years of censorship. Young Iranians bypassed restrictions to access these materials, turning private nostalgia into shared experience. For many women, the contrast was especially stark. Footage of academic campuses and public spaces from decades past highlighted freedoms that had since vanished. Analysts emphasized that when cultural grievances intersect with economic ones, mobilization accelerates. This resurgence of memory also had strategic implications beyond Iran's borders. Western policymakers assessed that a movement rooted in cultural and economic longing rather than narrow political demands is harder to neutralize. It seeks not reform, but restoration of dignity. NATO analysts quietly flagged this shift as significant regimes can often negotiate policy concessions, but they struggle to negotiate away memory. Economically, the nostalgia narrative reframed accountability. Protesters increasingly linked current hardship not to abstract forces, but to specific policy choices made over decades. The allocation of national resources toward external ventures rather than domestic welfare became a focal point of anger. Western energy experts warned that sustained unrest could further destabilize already fragile infrastructure, compounding shortages and deepening public resentment. Under President Donald Trump, U.S. strategists considered how such an internal reckoning might alter Iran's regional calculus. A leadership preoccupied with defending its historical narrative has less capacity to project confidence abroad. The erosion of ideological certainty can be as limiting as material constraints. On the streets, this shift manifested subtly. Chants evolved. Symbols changed. The movement's tone grew less reactive and more declarative, as if participants were no longer arguing against the present, but reaching toward an alternative future anchored in the past. Western movement analysts noted that this stage often precedes decisive moments when uncertainty gives way to expectation. Yet memory alone does not determine outcomes. It can inspire, but it can also provoke backlash. The regime still possessed coercive tools, and the question remained whether it would attempt to reassert control by force, or whether internal divisions would widen further. What followed next left little doubt that the struggle had crossed a threshold from contestation into inevitability. By the time the sixth phase unfolded, even cautious observers acknowledged that the crisis had crossed a point of no return. The question was no longer whether the unrest could be suppressed, but whether the state still possessed the coherence to reassert itself at all. The accumulated effects of blackout, defiance, territorial holding, nationwide synchronization, elite fractures, and the resurgence of collective memory converged into a single conclusion. Fear had changed sides. Reports from multiple cities showed security forces increasingly absent or passive. This was not a dramatic collapse, but a quiet erosion. Units remained in barracks longer. Patrols avoided direct confrontation. In some areas, uniformed personnel simply watched as crowds moved past. Western military psychologists describe this moment as command dissonance, when orders exist on paper but no longer translate into action on the ground. Once that dissonance sets in, coercive capacity decays rapidly. The regime's remaining tools, censorship, intimidation, selective arrests, produced diminishing returns. Internet disruptions were bypassed. Arrests triggered larger gatherings. Each move intended to restore control instead generated fresh momentum. Analysts noted a classic feedback loop: repression confirmed the protesters' narrative while restraint signaled weakness. Either choice carried cost. Internationally, the implications were profound. NATO analysts assessed that prolonged instability inside Iran would inevitably affect regional balances, from energy markets to proxy dynamics. A state consumed by internal crisis has limited bandwidth for external escalation. Under President Donald Trump, U.S. officials reportedly evaluated scenarios in which Tehran's strategic posture might become more defensive, constrained by domestic legitimacy concerns rather than deterrence calculations. Economically, the trajectory pointed downward. Capital flight accelerated. Revenue collection faltered. Infrastructure strain intensified. Western economists warned that even if unrest subsided, the aftershocks would linger, locking in long-term damage. In that sense, the crisis was not just political, but structural. Most telling, however, was the psychological shift in the streets. Protesters no longer behaved as if they were testing limits. They acted as if outcomes were already in motion. Western movement scholars emphasize that revolutions often hinge less on numbers than on expectation. Once a critical mass believes change is inevitable, participation becomes self-sustaining. The regime still stood, but it no longer commanded belief. Authority without belief is fragile. History suggests that such moments rarely reverse cleanly. They resolve through transition, rupture, or prolonged stagnation. Which path Iran would take remained uncertain, but the threshold had been crossed. Meanwhile, attention turned to what kind of future might emerge from the upheaval, and whether the forces now unleashed could translate momentum into a coherent next chapter. The events beginning on January 10th marked a decisive escalation. A blackout intended to silence Tehran instead unified it, transforming darkness into a catalyst. Protests evolved from fleeting demonstrations into sustained territorial presence. The unrest spread nationwide in synchronized waves, overwhelming security capacity and exposing institutional paralysis. Internal fractures within the regime deepened the crisis, while collective memory of pre-revolution life reframed the struggle as one of dignity, not just dissent. Together, these forces pushed Iran past a point of easy reversal. Looking ahead, analysts forecast a prolonged period of uncertainty. Even without immediate resolution, the structural damage to legitimacy, economy, and command cohesion will shape Iran's trajectory for years. For NATO, the U.S., and the wider region, the implications extend beyond Iran's borders, affecting energy security and strategic balance. So the key question remains: has Iran entered a transition phase, or merely a pause before a harder confrontation? If you're interested in following neutral analysis and multiple perspectives as events continue to unfold, would you consider subscribing to the channel to stay part of the discussion?